The sound came before the fear did. That is the part I still turn over. Months later, in a rented room, with a stove that ticks when the wind hits the flue just right. How the roar arrived a full second before my body understood what it meant. We were crossing a snowfield below the pass, maybe 200 feet below the notch where the rock walls pinched together, and the snow under our boots had the wet, heavy give of late May pack, the kind that sounds like a held breath with every step. My brother was 8, maybe 10 feet ahead of me, leaning into the grade the way he always did, shoulders forward, pack riding high, not a man who wasted motion on caution. I remember the sky was the flat gray of a lid, closed over a pot. I remember thinking it was too warm for the elevation. Then the slope above us let go. It did not fall so much as arrive, a wall of white filling the whole upper half of my sight, and the roar was not one sound but 100 sounds folded together, snow and rock and something underneath both, that I felt in my teeth before I heard it. I do not remember deciding to run. I remember the world tilting, and then the world was inside my coat, inside my mouth, packed hard against my ribs before I understood I was moving at all. I do not know how long the whiteout lasted. Long enough that I stopped being a person with thoughts and became only a thing trying to find air. When it stopped, and it stopped the way a held breath stops, all at once, with no warning, I was buried to the chest, one arm free, the other pinned at an angle that told me nothing was broken, only that the snow had set around me like poured concrete left an hour too long. I got the free arm working. I do not remember clawing, though my knuckles were split open later and packed with grit that took days to work loose. What I remember is silence, total and enormous, the kind that sits on a man's chest, heavier than the snow itself. He was not answering. I called his name. I will not write it here, only that I called it, twice, then a third time with my voice breaking somewhere in the middle of the word, and the mountain gave me nothing back. I dug with the one arm I had, then both once I'd torn the second free, packing snow behind me in fistfuls, not thinking about the rifle strapped to my pack, not thinking about the pick, not thinking about anything except the shape of a boot I thought I saw 11 feet downslope, gray wool against whiter snow, still as a stone that had always been there. I went for the boot before I went for anything else, throwing snow in armfuls that felt like they weighed nothing and everything at once, my breath tearing out of me in short white bursts that hung in the air longer than they should have. The boot did not move when I reached it. I remember thinking, with a clarity that frightened me more than the silence had, that a boot which does not shift under a man's weight belongs to a man who is either dead or has stopped trying. I dug faster. My hands found a leg, then a hip, then the angle of a shoulder turned wrong, and I pulled snow away from a face already going the color of the sky before a hard frost. But he was breathing. Shallow, ragged, but breathing. And when I said his name a fourth time, his eyes opened halfway and found mine, and he said only, "Get the rest of me out," which struck me then as the most ordinary thing a man could say after being buried alive, and which I have never forgotten since. It took the better part of an hour to free him fully, working with a broken piece of shale I'd found near his knee, because my hands had gone too numb to trust with fine work. He could not stand on his own for a while. We sat together in the lee of a granite outcrop that had itself been half-sheared by the slide, its face raw and pale where old rock had broken clean away, and we did not speak much, the way men don't when they've just understood how close a thing came, without either of them saying so aloud. It was only once my breath slowed, and the shaking in my hands eased enough to notice anything beyond the two of us, that I looked up past his shoulder and saw what the mountain had actually done. The slide had not simply buried the draw, it had torn the whole face open, a raw wound maybe 60 feet across where an entire shoulder of the slope had sheared loose and gone thundering down into the timber below, taking snow and scree and 2 stunted pines with it. What was left behind was granite, fresh broken, sharp-edged, catching the last low light of that afternoon in a way that made no sense to me at first, a shine that had no business being there in stone. Then I saw the color in it. Not gray, not the dull rust of iron-stained rock we'd passed 100 times on the walk up from Bozeman, but a deep violet, almost the color of a bruise gone old, running through the granite in a band as wide as a man's forearm and disappearing back into the mountain at an angle I couldn't yet judge. My brother followed my eyes without a word. Neither of us moved for a long moment, the cold forgotten, the fear forgotten, both of us just looking at a seam of purple crystal that, by every account either of us had ever heard of this country, had no right to be sitting there in the open air at all. My name doesn't matter much to this telling, and neither does my brother's, except to say I was the younger, by 5 years, 19 that spring, and he was 24, and between us we'd buried a father in Colorado dirt 6 years before and never stopped moving since. He'd gone into the mine after our father when the timbers gave, come out with 2 broken ribs and no father, and something in him had shut like a door that never opened again the same way. I was 14 then. I remember more of the silence after than the collapse itself, my mother's face gone gray in the lamplight, the coffin too narrow for what should have been a man's whole life. We left that country within the year. We hadn't stopped since. We'd come up from Bozeman 11 days before the mountain broke open in front of us, walking because we didn't have the fare for anything better. $14 between us when we set out, and less than that by the time we made the pass, spent on flour and salt pork, and a plug of tobacco my brother allowed himself once a week, like a man rationing his own patience. We carried what we owned on our backs, a Sharp's rifle worn silver at the breech that had been our father's before it was his, a single-hand pick, a hatchet with a handle my brother had replaced twice, a tin cup we passed between us at every stream, 2 packs gone thin at the seams. That was the whole of it. 2 young men and a dead man's rifle, and not much else standing between us, and whatever the country decided to do with us. We'd come looking for work, not fortune. A mining camp, rumored still operating somewhere past Cutthroat Pass. Men needed for timber, or grading, or anything that paid in coin, instead of promises. We hadn't found the camp yet. What we'd found instead, on a Tuesday afternoon, with the light already leaning gold and cold toward evening, was half a mountainside come down in an avalanche that by all rights should have killed us both, and a stone face laid open behind it, showing color no man had business finding in granite. I want it understood, before anything else gets told, how close to broke we were standing there. $6.40 left between us. No roof, no claim, no name on any paper anywhere that said this ground or what was in it belonged to us. Just 2 brothers who'd walked 11 days on grief and salt pork, standing at the edge of a wound the mountain had torn in itself, looking at a seam of violet crystal wide as a forearm, with the snow melt still weeks off, and the whole high country holding its breath around us, like it was deciding whether to let us keep what we'd found, or bury it again before nightfall. Thomas made the decision before the last of the light gave out, and I didn't argue it, though every part of me wanted to. We'd make camp 50 yards back from the scar, on a shelf of ground still holding snow in its shadowed corners, and we would not touch the rock face until morning, until we'd looked at it with clear eyes and full light and something other than the fever that comes on a man when he sees color where he expected only gray stone. That was Thomas all over. Our father had gone into that Colorado mine on a promise of good coal and steady pay, and he'd come out of it in pieces the company wouldn't even let us see whole, and Thomas had learned from that the way some men learn scripture, slow and permanent, and without room for argument. "Rock doesn't care how bad you want it," he said, working the picket line for the mule we didn't have, tying our one rope to a stunted pine instead. "Rock breaks the same, whether you're careful or you're a fool. Better to be careful." We ate the last of the salt pork cold, because building a fire big enough to cook by would have meant leaving the light and hunting deadwood in country we didn't know yet in the dark, and neither of us wanted that. We settled for a small one, low and mean, more for the look of it than the heat. Thomas was asleep inside the hour, worn down the way a man gets worn down walking 11 days on grief and empty stomach, and I lay there beside him with my eyes open, listening to the mountain settle after what it had just done to itself, small rattles of scree still finding their way down the new slope, and I could not make myself close my eyes. Near midnight I got up. I told myself I was only going to look at it again, that looking wasn't touching, and I believed that for about as long as it took me to reach the scar with the handpick still hooked through my belt. The face of it was cold under my palm, colder than the air even, and where the pick bit in it didn't crumble like ordinary quartz. It came away in a clean facet, a fist-sized piece falling into the snow at my boots with a sound like a coin dropped on a table. I carried it back to the fire before I let myself look at it properly, crouched low so the light wouldn't wake Thomas, and turned it slow in my hands. It was purple the way I'd never once seen purple. Not in any trading post case in Bozeman or Helena, not in any church window I'd stood under as a boy. Deep and clean and lit from somewhere inside itself when the flame caught it right. I sat there holding it a long while, the cold coming up through my boots, thinking about company men and expired maps, and how fast a mountain can change its mind about what it's willing to give a man. I must have slept some, because when I opened my eyes the fire had gone to coals, and the sky above the notch had turned the color of a bruise healing, gray going to pale yellow at the edges. Thomas was already up, standing at the scar with his hands loose at his sides, not touching anything, just looking the way I'd told myself I would only do the night before. I got up stiff and went to stand beside him, the amethyst piece still in my coat pocket where I'd put it before sleeping, heavy as a good river stone. It was Thomas who found the stakes. He walked the edge of the new scar the way he walks fence line when we've worked a season for some rancher wanting his boundary checked. Slow, eyes down, and about 40 feet along he stopped and crouched and pulled at something in the churned snow and dirt. It came up rotted through, the wood gone soft and gray, but there was enough of it left to see it had been driven deliberate, squared at the top the way a man squares a stake he means to find again. There were 3 more like it once we started looking, spaced out along what must have been a line somebody walked with a compass and a chain a long time before either of us was born. And near the 4th one, half buried, Thomas dug out with his fingers a scrap of tin no bigger than a playing card, bent and eaten with rust, but the stamped letters still legible if you turned it right to the light. Ashcroft Bellamy Mining Syndicate, and under that, smaller, a date, 1871. Thomas held it a long moment without saying anything. I watched his face do the thing it does when he's working a problem all the way through, before he lets himself speak on it, and I already didn't like what that meant. 13 years, he said finally, more to the tin than to me. Somebody surveyed this whole slope 13 years back and staked it, and then left it. Left it and forgot it, I said, wanting it to be true. Left it, he said, doesn't mean forgot. He turned the tag over once more, and set it down on a flat rock, careful, like it might still belong to somebody who'd come looking for it. Then he looked up the scar to where the veins sat open and bleeding purple into the gray morning, and I watched him do the arithmetic that I hadn't let myself do yet, that whatever we'd found here wasn't unclaimed ground the way I'd wanted to believe it was in the dark last night, with a fist-sized stone warming in my hands. It had a name on it already, stamped in tin, 13 years old and rusted through, but still a name, still a company, still men somewhere in an office, in a city neither of us had ever seen who might, for all we knew, still hold paper on this mountain. We're on borrowed time, Thomas said, and now it looks like borrowed ground too. Neither of us moved to touch the pick where it leaned against the boulder. Not yet. It was Thomas who noticed the second thing, not me, though I've thought since that I was the one always credited in my own head with noticing. He'd gone quiet, studying the slope below the scar where the snow had piled, and then partly melted into a gray slurry of gravel and broken timber, and he said there was something down there that didn't look like rock. I followed his line of sight and saw it too, a shape too regular, too square-cornered, half buried under a fan of debris maybe 60 yards below where we stood. We went down together, careful on the loose ground, and found it wedged between 2 boulders that the avalanche must have carried and dropped like a man setting down a load too heavy to carry further. A cache, old, built low and tight the way trappers and surveying men built them against animals and weather, log-cornered and chinked with mud gone hard as brick, the roof caved in on one side where 13 winters of snow had finally had their way with it. Inside, under a collapsed shelf and a scatter of tin cans rusted to lace, we found a satchel. Leather once, though it had gone the color and texture of old saddle leather, left out in weather too many years, stiff, cracked white along the folds, smelling of mildew and something colder underneath that. Thomas worked the buckle loose with his thumbnail, and it came apart in his hand, brittle, the strap crumbling like dried bread. Inside was a journal, its cover swollen with old damp, and on the flyleaf, in a hand gone faint but legible, a name, Elias Corrigan, surveyor, Ashcroft Bellamy Mining Syndicate, territory of Montana. We sat down right there on the wet ground and read what the damp hadn't taken from us. The company had come through in '71, chasing rumor the way companies do. Old-timers talk of a purple vein high in the rock that nobody had ever laid eyes on, but everyone swore was there. They surveyed for 2 years, dug test pits, found nothing but granite and disappointment, and in '73, the company pulled its men and its money out and went looking for easier ground elsewhere. All the men, the journal said, except one. Corrigan had stayed on alone, the entries said, certain the rumor was true, and the company simply hadn't dug deep enough or far enough, and he meant to prove it before he came down. The entries went on another few weeks, shorter each time, the hand getting rougher, then they stopped. There was no final report. There was no last page at all. Where it should have been, there was only a torn edge, ragged, close to the binding, like somebody had taken the last word away on purpose. Thomas closed the journal slow and looked back up the slope toward the scar, toward the purple bleeding into the gray, and neither of us said what we were both thinking about the man who'd been so sure and never came down. We found the cairn 30 yards below the cache, where the slope leveled out into a shelf of broken shale before it dropped again toward the timber. I might have walked past it if the light had been any different, just a heap of stones, gray on gray, the kind a man could mistake for glacial scatter if he wasn't looking close. But somebody had built it on purpose. The rocks were stacked too even, flat sides matched to flat sides, 3 feet high and narrowing toward the top the way a chimney narrows, and half sunk into moss that must have taken years to grow that thick. Thomas crouched and started pulling stones away before I could tell him not to. I don't know what either of us expected. Bones, maybe. A boot. Something a man leaves behind when the mountain finally gets tired of holding him up. What we found instead, 3 stones down, was brass, green-black with age, a long tube of it bent nearly double, a lens shattered and hanging loose in its housing like a pulled tooth, a transit, a surveyor's transit, the kind you set on a tripod to shoot a line across a valley and know, to the inch, where the company's money ought to be spent. Somebody had broken it before it went under the stones. Not dropped, broken. The tripod legs were separated and crossed like kindling, snapped clean, and the brass tube itself was dented in a way that spoke of being struck, hard, more than once. Thomas set it down on the flat rock beside him and didn't say anything for a while. Neither did I. The wind was moving through the scar above us, a low sound, almost a voice if you let yourself think it was. He didn't die here, Thomas said finally. Or, if he did, somebody else stacked these stones. Or he stacked them himself, I said, before. I don't know why I said it. It felt true the way certain things feel true in high country, not provable, just settled in the chest like weather. A man alone for a year, maybe more, watching the company's money and men pull out behind him, still certain the purple in the rock was real, still climbing this same slope morning after morning with his transit and his stakes, measuring angles into ground that gave him nothing back, and at some point deciding the instrument itself had failed him, or he'd failed it, and putting it under stones the way you'd put down anything that had let you down too many times to keep carrying. Thomas picked the broken transit back up, turned it once in his hands, and set it back exactly where he'd found it, stone by stone, rebuilding the cairn the way we'd found it. Man spent a year looking for what we tripped over in an afternoon, he said. He didn't say it like a joke. There wasn't a joke anywhere near it. He said it the way you'd say a debt was owed, and neither of us had any idea yet who it was owed to, or what the mountain might ask back before we were through. We walked back up the slope without talking, the way you do when the talking's already happened somewhere below words. The scar in the mountainside was still there when we came over the last rise, raw and pale in the late light, the amethyst catching what sun was left and throwing it back violet dark, like something bruised. I remember thinking it looked less like a discovery and more like a wound that hadn't decided yet whether to heal or keep bleeding. Thomas stood at the edge of it a long while, hands in his coat pockets, boots set wide the way he stood when he was working something out that didn't have a clean answer. Below us, further down than the cache, was the cairn we'd just rebuilt stone by stone, and I think that's what he was really looking at, not the rock. Tag says 71, he said finally. Company pulled their men out in 73. That's what the journal told us. I said it looked that way. 11 years since anybody from Ashcroft Bellamy set boot on this slope, far as we can tell. No fence, no notice posted, no man working it. He crouched, picked up a fist-sized piece of the vein, turned it so the light ran through it. Man who owned that transit died looking for this, and never told a soul where he thought it was, because there wasn't anybody left to tell. So it's not stealing, I said, if there's nobody minding it. Didn't say that. He set the stone back down, careful, like it might still belong to somebody. Company's name is still stamped on the tag, that's a fact, same as the purple's a fact. I'm not going to stand here and tell you it's clean, Wade, because it isn't. Man worked for wages under that name, died poor for it, probably, same as most men who work for wages under any name. He looked at me then, and there wasn't any softness in it, just weighing. But the mountain opened up on its own. Didn't need a company survey, or a company crew, or 10 more years of a man's life spent squinting through a busted transit. It came down on a Tuesday and showed us what it wanted to show us. I don't know how a man argues that belongs to a company office in Helena that hasn't sent so much as a letter up here in over a decade. So we work it, I said. We work it fast, he said, and we work it quiet, and we don't leave sign, we don't have to leave. Pass closes in a matter of weeks, not months. Any surveyor, any company man, any fool with a mule and a reason to come up this valley finds this before we've cleared it. We've got nothing but a story nobody'll believe and a debt we can't pay. He stood, wiped his palm down his trouser leg, like the decision itself needed cleaning off. We take what the mountain gave up. We don't go looking for more than that, and we don't stay past when it's safe to leave. I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything worth saying. We went back down for the packs, and by the time full dark came on, we'd already started figuring which slope face would hide a fire best, and how many hours of daylight stood between us and whatever the rest of that season meant to cost. We started the next morning before the sky had gone past gray, and we did not stop in any way that could be called stopping for 9 days after that. He took the first 4 hours with the pick, working the seam where the crystal ran thickest, and I hauled what broke free down to where the sacks waited, folded flat until they had something to hold. Then we traded. 4 hours on, 4 hours off, around a clock neither of us could see, but both of us kept in our bodies, the way you keep count of a debt. Sleep came in scraps. An hour against a boulder still cold from the night before. Another hour with a coat pulled over the face, to keep the light out when the sun finally climbed high enough to matter. Neither of us dreamed, or if we did, neither of us remembered it, which amounted to the same thing. The pick handle wore a groove into my palm by the 3rd day, and by the 5th, the groove had opened and closed itself into something less like a blister and more like a second mouth. His hands went the same way, cracked at the knuckle where the cold and the rock and the dry air worked against each other, and neither of us said anything about it because saying something wouldn't have changed the work. We wrapped what needed wrapping in strips torn from a shirt too far gone to matter, and kept moving. Each sack, once full, weighed close to 11 pounds, and we counted them the way other men count money, because in every way that mattered to us, they were the same thing. By the end of it, there were 31 of them lined along the base of the rock face like something waiting for a wagon that didn't exist yet. 341 pounds of purple stone pulled out of a mountain that hadn't known it was carrying it until the snow let go and showed us where to dig. He kept the food separate from all of it, kept it in his head more than in his hands. $6.40 standing between us and whatever the last of the season demanded. He cut the bacon thinner than either of us wanted and stretched the coffee past the point where it tasted like coffee, and he did the arithmetic out loud sometimes, low, more to himself than to me, the way a man recites something he's afraid of forgetting. I watched him do that math on the fourth night and understood, without him saying it, that he was not counting days until we finished. He was counting days until the mountain closed the road behind us, one way or the other. On the ninth day, a Tuesday by my own reckoning, though I'd stopped trusting the count, we heard the horse before we saw it. A labored, shale-slipping climb that carried up through the rock the way sound does in high country, arriving long before its source. Thomas set the pick down without a word. We had talked about this possibility the way men talk about weather they hope not to see, and now here it was, coming up the same switchback we'd used 11 days before, except mounted and unhurried, and certain of its right to be there. He was a heavy man in a canvas coat too warm for the season, riding a bay gelding that didn't like the scree, and he stopped 40 feet off and sat looking at the sacks lined against the rock face before he looked at us at all. That told me something about him already, the order of his attention. "That's syndicate ground," he said, not a question. He had a foreman's voice, flat and used to being obeyed by men who couldn't afford not to. His eyes went to the rusted stake still standing crooked where the slide had left it, and something in his face settled, satisfied, the way a man's face settles when an argument he expected to have turns out easier than feared. Ashcroft Bellamy holds this pass, has since before either of you were old enough to walk it. Thomas didn't answer him right away, and I understood that silence was its own kind of arithmetic, my brother deciding what a heavy man on a good horse was owed in the way of respect, and coming up with very little. "I'll be reporting this to the Butte office," the foreman said, when no answer came. "Trespass. Theft of company mineral rights. There's men done less time for less than what's sitting in those sacks." He said it looking at me longer than at Thomas, the way men size up which brother is soft enough to frighten. I felt the look land and didn't move under it, though something in my chest had gone tight and small. He nudged the bay a step closer, close enough that I could see the mud dried into the seams of his boots, the practiced boredom in how he held the reins, a man who had ridden up mountains to deliver this exact speech more than once in his working life, and expected no more trouble from us than from the rock itself. I thought of the tin tag in my coat pocket, and I did not reach for it yet. I took it out slow, the way you'd draw a knife you didn't want mistaken for a threat. The tag was smaller than his belt buckle, greened at the edges, the stamped letters gone soft with corrosion but still legible if you knew where to look, which by then I did, having turned it over in my hands 100 times in 9 days of shifts. I held it up where the light could get at it, and I read it aloud, not fast, not proud, just steady, the way Thomas read, "Weather off a sky." Ashcroft Bellamy Mining Syndicate, 1871. Territorial Code says, "A filed claim lapses automatic after 10 years unworked. Nobody swung a pick on this ledge since your company pulled out in 73. That's 11 years gone dark, 3 years past lapse." I let that sit. Whatever this was, it isn't yours anymore. It hasn't been yours since 1881. The foreman's jaw worked once, a small chewing motion, like he was testing a word before deciding against it. His eyes went to the tag and stayed there longer than they'd gone to either of our faces the whole ride up, longer than they'd gone to the sacks stacked behind us, longer than pride should have allowed a man like him to look at a piece of rusted tin held by a boy 19 years old. I watched him do the arithmetic Thomas had done earlier, except his came out different, not what we were owed, but what he could prove, and the difference between those two things is where every claim like his lives or dies. His horse shifted under him, restless, tired of standing on a slope, and he let it turn a half step before he caught the reins again, and in that half turn I saw something go out of him, not anger, not even disappointment exactly, just the particular tiredness of a man realizing the speech he'd ridden 2 hours to give had no ground left under it. He didn't ask to see the tag closer. He didn't ask where we'd found it. Some part of him already knew, the way you know a debt's gone bad before the bank tells you. "Territorial Code," he said, mostly to himself, mostly bitter, and then he said nothing else. He turned the bay full around, unhurried, a man saving what dignity a slow exit could still buy him, and started back down through the scree, without another word to either of us, and I stood there with the tag still warm from my hand, watching him go, not yet believing what I was watching. We didn't celebrate. Thomas just picked the pick back up and said we had 6 days before the pass shut, and 6 days was what we used, working the shifts we'd worked all along, until the ledge gave up what it meant to give, and the flour sacks stood in a row like something buried, and dug up again on purpose. 31 of them. We hired a mule train out of a camp 2 days below, 4 animals, a packer named Osgood who didn't ask what was in the sacks, and didn't need to, not with the way we watched him load them. We came down off that mountain the last week of September, the aspens already gone yellow, the first hard frost sitting white on the grass some mornings, and I remember looking back once at the scar in the mountainside, gray and raw against the timber, already half forgotten by everything around it that didn't need remembering. We sold the bulk of it in Helena that November, 2 buyers, a jeweler, and a man who dealt in mineral specimens for collectors back east, and when the second one counted out the last of it, the total came to $2,340, more money than either of us had ever held in our 2 hands together, more than our father made in 3 years underground. I'm writing this now from a rented room above a hardware store, months gone by, snow on the window again, and I think less about the money than about the cairn we left standing on that slope, the surveyor's grave, if you want to call it that, unmarked, unclaimed, a man who died reaching for the exact thing we walked away with. I don't know what separates his ledger from ours except that we lived to write one. The mountain doesn't keep books. It doesn't care what a man's owed or what he's earned. It only cares what he's willing to carry down before the snow comes. Thomas is asleep in the other bed as I write this. I can hear him breathing. That's the whole inheritance, when you get down to it. Not the sacks, not the money, just the sound of somebody you trust still breathing in the dark. If you've got a brother or a sister or anybody you've walked hard country with, tell us about it below. We'd like to hear it. And if this found you tonight, consider staying with us. There's more country ahead and more of what it's buried.